They thought it was a trick, a cruel joke, or perhaps a psychological experiment. After all, who had ever heard of a country that would give prisoners of war access to libraries and free books? The soldiers had been prepared for much during their captivity: starvation, brutality, and hard labor. But what they found when they entered the American POW camps in 1945 defied everything they had been told, and everything they had believed. The first shock came when they were escorted to the camp's library, a small, quiet building filled with shelves of books, the very same books that had been denied to them under the oppressive regime they had left behind. The idea that prisoners of war, enemies, no less, could have access to such a luxury felt like a farce. They had heard whispers as they were marched through the American lines. "They have libraries," some muttered, while others laughed at the absurdity of it. How could a nation, whose soldiers they had been taught to despise, offer such an indulgence to the very people who had caused them so much suffering? "Are they mocking us?" some wondered. It felt more like a propaganda move than an actual reality. No nation in their right mind would allow an enemy to read freely, would they? But there it was. They were led inside, and the first sight they beheld was the sheer volume of books, their spines lined up neatly in rows. History books, novels, and scientific journals. There were even comic books, a genre they had never expected to see. The sight was staggering. It seemed too good to be true. Surely this was just another ploy, a distraction, meant to break their spirits. No, this couldn't be real. Some of them stood frozen at the entrance, hesitant to enter. They had been raised to believe that everything about the enemy was meant to be cynical and manipulative. The Soviets had been a brutal reminder of what captivity could mean, and German propaganda had painted the Americans as ruthless invaders. The last thing they expected was the gift of intellectual freedom. What was the point of reading when the war was already lost? As the days passed, more soldiers wandered into the library, their curiosity overtaking their initial skepticism. They were drawn to the shelves, uncertain but eager to find something, anything, that might distract them from the reality of their situation. The books were more than just distractions, they were a window into a world that had once seemed so foreign, so beyond their understanding. Some soldiers gravitated toward the novels, stories of far-off lands, of fantasy and adventure. Others, however, found themselves opening books that questioned their very beliefs. History books that recounted the rise of the American experiment, the idea of a democratic society, the very ideals that had been taught to them as dangerous propaganda. As they read, they found themselves stunned by the simplicity of it all: freedom of thought. But it wasn't just the content of the books that unsettled them, it was the concept itself. America had handed them freedom, in the form of knowledge, something they had never once been afforded. In Germany, the Third Reich had censored and controlled what they could read. Propaganda was the only truth. Books were tools to support the regime, not for learning or self-growth. The idea that these Americans, who had fought them so fiercely, would open the door to knowledge left many soldiers confused, questioning the very values they had been raised with. As they spent more time in the library, the soldiers began to ask themselves deeper questions. Could it be that the Americans, the very people they had been taught to hate and fear, had something to teach them about the world? Some soldiers picked up books about American history, while others turned to novels and short stories. They had been told that the Americans were nothing but capitalists and enemies, but now they saw another side to the U.S. culture: the thirst for knowledge, the love of learning, and a society that valued individual thought. The soldiers began to reflect on their own history and upbringing. They realized that Germany had always restricted what could be read. Books were controlled by the government, and even the most innocent texts could be censored. To see so many unrestricted books in the hands of prisoners left them stunned. The idea of free books was something they simply could not comprehend at first. They had grown up in a society where books were often a luxury, controlled by the state and only available to those who complied. But now, in the hands of the Americans, books were a gift, one that had no price, no conditions attached. This was more than just an educational tool, it was a symbol of freedom, a stark contrast to the indoctrination they had endured for years. At first, they assumed the books were a form of American trickery, meant to break their spirits. But soon, as they read more, the truth became evident: freedom could only exist when people were allowed to think for themselves. And the Americans had given them that freedom, even in their captivity. This realization was more than just a cultural shock, it was a psychological shift. The soldiers began to understand that, despite everything they had been taught, they had been living in a world where knowledge had been carefully curated for them. And now, for the first time, they had the opportunity to explore a world of unfiltered ideas. In the quiet moments of reflection, some soldiers couldn't help but wonder, what would happen when the war ended? What would they return to? Could they ever go back to a world that had been so carefully controlled? Or had their eyes been opened to a new reality, a reality where ideas were free to roam, where books could tell the truth, and where a man could think for himself without fear of punishment? They didn't know the answer yet, but one thing was clear. The books they had found in the American camps had given them a glimpse into a different world, one where freedom, truth, and knowledge were the foundation of society. And that, in itself, was a discovery that none of them would ever forget. The days inside the American POW camps began to stretch into weeks, and with each passing day, the soldiers found themselves wrestling not only with their new reality but also with the concepts that had previously been foreign to them. The libraries, which had once seemed like an absurdity, had become a lifeline. Books, once considered mere distractions or tools of propaganda, were now gateways to a new way of thinking, one that had once been forbidden. At first, the soldiers approached the books with suspicion. They had been taught to believe that knowledge was a tool of control, that information had been carefully shaped to fit the needs of the Third Reich. Books were never tools of freedom in their minds, they were tools of state control. But here, in the quiet of the American camps, they found something unexpected, a new kind of freedom, the freedom to explore ideas without restriction. Some of them began with books on American history, curious about the nation that had so thoroughly defeated them. The founding of the United States seemed like a far-off, almost impossible dream, a nation built not just on land or military might, but on the principle of individual liberty. The more they read, the more they began to wonder, how could such a system exist, especially in the face of a world that seemed destined for totalitarian rule? How had these Americans come to value ideas so highly, when Germany had stripped them of the very right to think freely? The psychological shift was subtle at first. They still had their doubts, of course. Some of them would argue that the Americans were merely attempting to use their books to reprogram their minds, to make them more amenable to American ideology. But as time went on, the sheer volume of available material made it impossible to deny, these weren't captive tools of manipulation, they were genuine expressions of thought. One soldier, who had once been a staunch believer in the Nazi cause, sat quietly in a corner of the library, engrossed in a book on philosophy. It was something he had never read before, the writings of thinkers like Socrates and Plato, thinkers who had challenged the very nature of authority and power. The idea that someone could question the status quo, that a society could be built on reason and debate, was a concept that had been entirely foreign to him. Yet, as he read on, he felt his old beliefs begin to crumble, one page at a time. The books on democracy, justice, and equality left him with a strange feeling, one of discomfort and awakening. Could it be possible that the world he had fought for, the world that had promised order and discipline, was built on lies? The more he read, the more he realized that his understanding of freedom, truth, and justice had been shaped by forces outside of his control. Could it be that the American soldiers, his enemies, had been right all along? The books were not just intellectual tools, they were emotional mirrors. For some, they became a form of catharsis, a way to confront the guilt of their actions during the war. They could no longer deny the devastation they had caused, nor could they ignore the profound human cost of the war. As they read about American democracy, they realized the magnitude of their own country's crimes. The more they learned, the more they understood that the war was not just a battle of arms, it was a battle for the very soul of humanity. One soldier, a former officer who had spent years commanding soldiers in the field, found himself drawn to books on ethics and morality. These were subjects he had never considered important before the war. They had been conditioned to see morality as something relative, shaped by the needs of the state. But now, in the quiet of the prison camp, as he read about human rights and the intrinsic value of life, he began to question his own role in the war machine. Could he have made different choices? Could he have fought for something more than just loyalty to a leader who promised victory? The books opened his eyes to the depth of his own involvement in the destruction of innocent lives. The realization was painful, but it was also liberating. For the first time, he saw that true freedom didn't come from following orders, it came from thinking for oneself. As the soldiers spent more time in the library, their conversations began to shift. No longer did they discuss battle strategies or the failings of their enemies. Now, they debated ideas. They began discussing freedom, democracy, and individual rights. They spoke of the future, of how the world might look after the war, and whether they could ever return to the lives they had known. The act of reading had transformed them, slowly and subtly. As they explored new ideas and questioned their old beliefs, their identities began to shift. No longer were they simply soldiers, they were now thinkers, learners, explorers of ideas they had never considered before. And for the first time in years, they began to see a future beyond the war. It wasn't a future of victory or glory, but a future where they could begin again, on their own terms. And here's the truth, if you think these books were just a distraction, think again. They weren't just a form of entertainment for the soldiers, they were a tool for personal transformation. The American POW camps didn't just give them food and rest. They gave them something far more valuable, the ability to think freely, to imagine a world where their choices were no longer dictated by others. The intellectual awakening they experienced in those camps would change them forever. Subscribe now to follow the journey of those who discovered a new world of ideas, even in captivity. As the weeks turned into months, the soldiers who had once been so resolute in their beliefs began to experience an unsettling transformation. They had always been told that surrender was the ultimate disgrace, a betrayal of their country, and their identity as German soldiers had been defined by their loyalty to the Third Reich. Now, in the quiet stillness of the American POW camps, they found themselves confronting a truth they had never expected: their loyalties had been built on lies, and the world they had fought for no longer existed. The books they had come to embrace were more than just distractions, they were windows into a new world, a world where ideas were free, where thought was not limited by the boundaries of state-controlled propaganda. For the first time, they were exposed to the idea that truth could be objective and that freedom of thought was a right, not a privilege reserved for a few. The German soldiers began to understand that the American way of life, which they had been taught to hate, was rooted in something far deeper than just military superiority or economic power. It was about the freedom to think, to question, and to live beyond the constraints of a totalitarian state. The soldiers' minds were like sponges, soaking up the new ideas around them. Many of them had once believed that they were fighting for a greater cause, a greater ideal, but now they saw that their cause had been based on an illusion. The Nazi ideology they had been taught was rooted in the belief that the state controlled every aspect of life, including thought. They had been conditioned to follow orders without question, to serve their country and their leader without hesitation. But now, they began to see that freedom of thought was not something to be feared, it was something to be cherished. The books became a lifeline for the soldiers. As they read, they began to uncover a truth that had been hidden from them for most of their lives: the government had not only controlled what they did, but also what they thought. Propaganda had been the only truth they had ever known. The soldiers began to reflect on how they had been taught to worship their leaders, to follow them blindly, without ever questioning their decisions or the policies they enacted. The American books opened their eyes to the idea that personal responsibility and critical thinking were not only important, they were essential. Some soldiers found themselves drawn to books that questioned the very concept of authority. The works of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were a revelation for them. They had been taught that to question authority was a dangerous act, but the books they now read showed them that questioning authority was the foundation of philosophy, the core of intellectual freedom. They began to see that the Nazi regime had stifled their ability to think critically, and that their blind obedience had cost them more than just victory in the war, it had cost them their individuality. The more they read, the more they began to understand that freedom of thought was not just an American luxury, it was a fundamental human right. It was something that had been denied to them for so long, but now, in captivity, they were experiencing it firsthand. The very act of reading was an act of freedom. Each page they turned was a step away from the state control they had known, a step closer to self-realization. As they absorbed the words of American authors, they began to see themselves not as soldiers caught in the machinery of war, but as individuals capable of independent thought. The soldiers began to compare their present reality with the world they had once fought to preserve. They had been raised in a world where the state controlled every aspect of their lives, from what they read to how they thought. But now, in the American camps, they were being exposed to a different reality, one in which the individual mattered, where ideas were allowed to flow freely, and where people were encouraged to think for themselves. For many of them, this was a profound shock, one that left them questioning everything they had once believed. But the realization of their own indoctrination was not without its painful consequences. For some, the truth they found in the books was a bitter pill to swallow. They had spent years believing in the ideals of the Nazi Party, and to now realize that those ideals had been a lie was almost too much to bear. For others, the revelation was less devastating, but still profound. They began to see that the world they had fought for was not the world they had imagined. It was a world built on lies, on deception, and on the manipulation of the masses. The books not only shattered their beliefs but also opened their eyes to the world outside the war, a world where people could live without the weight of a totalitarian regime hanging over them. They began to understand the true cost of their blind obedience, the cost of a world that had been shaped by their inability to think for themselves. The soldiers had been taught to worship authority, to follow orders without question, but now they saw that the freedom to think was the most precious gift of all. And here's the truth, if you think the books in the American POW camps were just a temporary distraction, you're mistaken. They weren't just a form of escape, they were a means of transformation. Through the freedom to read and think, the soldiers were breaking free from the mental chains that had kept them locked in a false reality. Their surrender had given them more than just physical survival, it had given them the chance to reclaim their minds. If you think you understand what these men went through, you're missing the true depth of their psychological journey. Subscribe now to see how they learned to think for themselves, and how their exposure to freedom of thought forever changed them. The days began to blur together as they settled into life in the American POW camps. But for the soldiers, there was no escaping the truth that had begun to seep into their minds. The war was over, and with it, their identity as soldiers, as German patriots fighting for a cause, was no more. The surrender had robbed them of their uniforms, their ranks, and their place in a society that had proudly trained them to believe that they were part of something greater than themselves. Now, they were no longer soldiers, they were prisoners. They had no nation to fight for, no cause to champion. At first, the men struggled with the idea of identity loss. They were no longer warriors, but they had not yet figured out who they were without the war. They were men who had been molded by ideology, by propaganda, and by the strictures of a war machine that had left them little room for personal freedom. But now, surrounded by the freedom to think and question, they began to realize that the war had not only taken away their futures, it had taken away their true selves. The books had already begun to change the way they saw the world, but it was not just the American ideals or the political philosophies that made the most impact. It was the simple act of being able to think freely that truly unraveled the fabric of who they had once been. Without the constant pressure of military service, without the relentless drumbeat of propaganda, the soldiers now had the space to question their loyalties, their actions, and their values. Some of them began to wonder if their surrender had been the beginning of their real battle, not on the battlefield, but within themselves. The soldiers who had once thought they were defending Germany's honor now grappled with the truth. What had they truly been fighting for? They had been trained to believe that their sacrifice was noble, that the cause was just, that the Third Reich was superior. Now, after months of reflection and learning, they were left with nothing but the haunting question: were they wrong? As they discussed the books they had read, their conversations shifted from battlefield tactics to the future. What kind of world would exist after the war? Could they go back to the lives they had once known, or would they have to live with the fact that their very identities had been molded by a lie? They spoke of Germany, the destruction it had suffered, and the pieces of their past that they might never see again. But there was something else in their voices now, an uncertainty, a quiet yearning for something more than the glory they had been promised. There were those who found it easier to cling to the old beliefs, who still believed in the greatness of Germany and the honor of their soldiers. They resisted the changes they saw in the others, clinging to the old ideologies they had been raised with. They found solace in the old rhetoric, in the ideals that had sustained them through the worst of the war. But even they couldn't ignore the cracks in their once unshakable faith. The books they read, the conversations they had with their fellow prisoners, all pointed to the uncomfortable truth: the war was not about honor, not about sacrifice, but about the control of minds, the destruction of individuality, and the crushing weight of blind obedience. The idea that Germany's cause had been a lie began to sink in, and for some, the realization was devastating. They had been part of something that promised glory and greatness, but it had left them with nothing but ruin. The destruction of Germany was not just a physical collapse, it was the collapse of everything they had believed in. The books offered a stark contrast to everything they had known. But now, they had to figure out what to do with that new knowledge. For some, the path forward was clear. They would try to rebuild their lives after the war, to start anew. They began to see that the old world, the world of war and nationalism, was gone. And in its place was the possibility of a new world, a world where individuality, freedom, and responsibility mattered more than loyalty to a state. But the road to that new future was not an easy one. It was fraught with questions about who they were now, what they could offer the world, and how they could ever find peace after such a devastating conflict. The realization that their surrender had led them to a new beginning wasn't just about survival, it was about personal redemption. Some began to embrace the idea that, through education, through free thought, they could find a new purpose in life. The shame they felt over their actions in the war would always be with them, but they understood that thinking for themselves was the only way forward. It was the only way to reclaim the pieces of themselves that had been lost during the war. And the books, the freedom to read, were the key to that redemption. For those who had truly surrendered not just their weapons but their old lives, the books were more than just words on a page. They were the means to rebuild what had been destroyed. The truth they had sought in battle was now available to them in a way they had never imagined. And with that knowledge came a new power, the power to think, to choose, and to redefine who they were. And here's the truth: surrendering wasn't just about losing a war, it was about losing everything they had once believed. But in that loss, they found something else: the chance to rebuild their lives on their own terms, with their own minds. They weren't just soldiers anymore, they were men capable of thinking for themselves. They had the opportunity to build a future that wasn't defined by the past they had left behind. Subscribe now to see how the discovery of freedom of thought gave these men the chance to reclaim their humanity, one book at a time. The days in the American POW camps passed with a rhythm that they had never expected. The soldiers had been prepared for hunger, for hardship, for brutality, but not for this strange, almost unsettling peace that had begun to settle over them. They had surrendered, and with that surrender came the loss of identity. They were no longer soldiers, no longer part of a war machine. But as the weeks turned to months, the struggle began, the struggle to reconcile the new knowledge they had gained with the old truths they had once believed. The books had opened their eyes to a new world, one where ideas were free, where individual thought was encouraged, where the state was not the center of everything. They had been taught to view the Americans as nothing but invaders, as the enemy who had to be destroyed at all costs. But the more they read, the the more they began to see that the Americans weren't just their enemies, they were part of a system built on the values of liberty and freedom. But this knowledge came at a price that they were still unsure of how to pay. The realization that their entire worldview had been shaped by lies was a bitter pill to swallow. They had been trained to believe that their cause was just, that they were fighting for the glory of Germany, for the honor of their nation. But now, in the quiet of the prison camp, they were faced with the truth. Their cause had been nothing more than a facade, a propaganda machine that had manipulated them for years. The soldiers began to talk among themselves. Some were angry, unable to accept that everything they had been taught, the very core of their identity, had been a lie. They had believed in the glory of battle, in the sacrifice they made for their country, but now that sacrifice felt meaningless. They had given their lives to a cause that no longer seemed worth fighting for. Others were more reflective, turning inward to question not just the war, but everything they had believed in up until now. The books they had read had taught them that freedom of thought was the foundation of a just society, and that democracy allowed for individuality, for the right to choose one's own path. But how could they reconcile that with the regimes that had taught them to suppress their own voices? How could they reconcile the truth they had discovered with the truth they had lived by for so long? The reconciliation was painful. The soldiers had surrendered in the face of overwhelming force, and now they faced a new battle, a battle within themselves. The knowledge they had gained from the books had opened their eyes to a new reality, but it also left them with an overwhelming sense of loss. They had been fighting for something that now seemed insignificant in the grand scheme of things. The honor of being a soldier, the pride of being a part of the Third Reich, no longer held any weight. The truth was, the soldiers had surrendered, but they had also given up a part of themselves. The honor they once fought for had been shattered, but in its place, they began to feel an unfamiliar freedom, a freedom that was both exhilarating and terrifying. It was the freedom to think for themselves, to see the world in a way that didn't revolve around nationalism, propaganda, or war. But the psychological weight of this new reality was heavy. They had been taught that to question authority was a sin, a betrayal of the very fabric of their society. And now, with everything they had believed in unraveling, they began to question their loyalties to their country, to the cause they had served. It wasn't just about the war anymore, it was about who they were. Some soldiers tried to return to the way things had been before, seeking solace in the old ideologies. They looked for something familiar in the books they read, but the more they read, the more they realized that the world they had fought for no longer existed. Germany was gone, its glory reduced to rubble, and with it, their sense of self. Others, however, took a different path. They began to embrace the new world they had discovered in the American books. The freedom to think for themselves, the idea that individuality was valuable, and that democracy allowed for the flourishing of ideas, this was a world they had never known. Some soldiers began to speak of a new Germany, one that could rise from the ashes of defeat, built on the principles of freedom, justice, and personal responsibility. But even as they embraced these new ideals, the price of knowledge was clear. They had to face the fact that they had been a part of something they now understood to be wrong. The weight of guilt and shame hung over them like a cloud. But the books had given them a new sense of purpose, a new way to rebuild themselves, not as soldiers, but as individuals. And here's the truth, if you think surrendering was the hardest thing they had to do, think again. The real struggle came after, when they had to confront the truth of their own beliefs, their own actions, and their identity. The knowledge they gained in the American camps wasn't just about learning, it was about transforming. It was about confronting their past, facing the guilt and shame, and finding a way forward in a world that had shattered their understanding of everything they once knew. Subscribe now to follow how this transformation continues, and how the books that changed them began to shape their new reality. The sun barely broke through the morning fog as the soldiers gathered once again in the corner of the POW camp. They had been through months of captivity, each day feeling like an eternity. And yet, it wasn't the long days or the uncertain future that weighed most heavily on them, it was the truth that had begun to settle into their minds like a heavy stone, the realization that everything they had fought for, everything they had believed in, had been nothing more than a lie. The books in the American camps had shattered the illusions they had clung to for so long. The soldiers who had once been convinced that their cause was just, that their nation was superior, were now struggling to come to terms with the knowledge that they had fought for a regime that had brought nothing but suffering and destruction. The shame of surrendering had already left a deep mark on them, but the emotional toll of facing the truth about their role in the war was something far more difficult to process. The psychological scars of the war were not easily healed. In the quiet of the camp, they would sit together and reflect on the events that had led to their captivity. Some of them had been officers, leading men into battle, while others had been simple soldiers, following orders without question. But now, they all shared one thing in common: they had surrendered. The weight of that surrender was not just about losing the war, it was about losing everything they had once believed in. Some of the soldiers felt a sense of guilt that was almost unbearable. They had been raised to believe that Germany was destined to rule, that the Third Reich was invincible, and that the Nazis were the saviors of the nation. But now, they saw the war for what it truly was: a catastrophic failure that had cost millions of lives, including their own families and loved ones. The realization that they had been part of such a monstrous machine was a hard pill to swallow. The books in the camps had taught them new ideas, ideas that had never been part of their training, never part of their indoctrination. They had learned about democracy, freedom, and the right to self-determination, concepts that had been foreign to them for so long. But these ideas did not come without a price. The more they read, the more they realized that freedom of thought had been denied to them, not just by the Nazis, but by the very system of control that had governed their lives. The concept of personal responsibility, of being able to make decisions for themselves, was a radical idea for soldiers who had been taught to follow orders without question. In the silence of the camp, they would talk about their future, unsure of what lay ahead. The Americans had promised that they would be treated fairly and sent home once the war was over, but what did that future look like? Could they ever return to Germany? And if so, would they be welcomed, or would they be rejected for their part in the war? The guilt they carried was not just about their role in the military, but about their entire lives, the choices they had made, and the consequences of those choices. Some of the soldiers began to see that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about accepting it. They could never undo the damage they had caused, but they could begin to rebuild themselves. They had been given a second chance, not just to survive, but to live with a new sense of purpose. The books had opened their eyes to the possibility of a life built on new principles, principles of freedom, individuality, and self-determination. But the journey toward redemption was far from simple. The struggle was not just about rebuilding their nation, it was about rebuilding themselves. They had spent so long living according to someone else's rules, someone else's vision of the world. Now, they had to reclaim their own identities, but that meant accepting the truth of what they had done. It meant confronting the shame of their actions and asking themselves whether they could ever find peace with the past. Some soldiers had a hard time letting go of their former loyalties, while others embraced the new ideas with open arms. The camp became a place where they could discuss the possibilities for their future. The more they talked, the more they realized that they were not just soldiers, they were men who had been broken by a war they had not fully understood. And now, in the quiet moments of captivity, they had a chance to rebuild what had been lost, not just their lives, but their souls. And here's the truth: if you think they were just waiting to return home, you're missing the bigger picture. The journey to redemption was not a simple one, nor was it a path without obstacles. For the soldiers, surrendering had opened the door to a world of questions they had never before considered. The books in the camps had given them the freedom to think, to reflect, and to grow beyond the war. But the cost of that growth was high. They would never be the same again. The real battle for them was not the war itself, it was the battle for self-understanding, for forgiveness, and for the chance to start over in a world that had been forever changed by the actions of their past. Subscribe now to follow the rest of their journey, as they struggle to find a place in the world they had once tried to conquer. As the war officially ended and the soldiers were slowly released from the American POW camps, the question that hung over their heads was no longer one of survival, it was about identity. The men who had once been bound by uniforms and military ranks were now faced with the daunting task of reclaiming their lives in a world that had been forever altered by the destruction of the war. For months, they had lived in the shadow of defeat, quietly reflecting on their past actions, and most importantly, on the knowledge that had been bestowed upon them in captivity. The books they had read had opened their eyes to a world where thought and freedom could flourish. But with that knowledge came a reality: they could never go back to the world they had once known. Germany, as it had existed, was no more. The Third Reich was gone, reduced to ashes, and now they were left with nothing but their memories and the painful truth that their country had been defeated, and the cause they had fought for had been false. Some of them tried to return to Germany, hoping that things could somehow go back to the way they were before the war. But when they arrived, Germany was nothing like what they remembered. The cities were in ruins, the streets were empty and silent, and the sense of pride that had once filled the hearts of every German soldier was now gone, replaced by a haunting despair. Germany had been reduced to rubble, and so too had their old identities. They had fought for something that no longer existed, and now, they had to figure out where they belonged in this broken world. The men who returned home found that they were not met with the warm embraces they had expected. There was no hero's welcome waiting for them. They were not greeted as victors, they were greeted as the defeated, the captured, the men who had surrendered. The shame of their surrender followed them wherever they went. They had lost everything, not just their honor, but their country, their status, and their place in the world. For some, this was a difficult truth to accept. The pride they had once felt in serving their country had been replaced with a feeling of emptiness. They had spent years fighting for an ideal that now seemed like a distant dream, and they couldn't help but wonder if there was any way to reclaim that pride. Could they ever be proud again? Could they find a way to rebuild their lives after everything had been destroyed? But there were others who had changed more profoundly. The books they had read had left a lasting impact, one that could not easily be erased. Some soldiers, rather than returning to the shattered remnants of Germany, decided to start over in a new world, one where their ideas were no longer shaped by the propaganda they had been fed, but by their own experiences and new insights. They began to see that survival wasn't just about living through the war, it was about living with themselves in a world where freedom of thought was possible, and where choices were no longer dictated by the state. Some of these men began to seek out a future outside of Germany, where the freedom to think for themselves wasn't a luxury. It was a fundamental right. The Americans had shown them that a world existed where the individual was valued, where ideas could be freely discussed without the fear of being persecuted. It was a world where books could be read without the state censoring them, where personal and political freedom were not only possible but encouraged. As they integrated into this new world, the soldiers began to reflect on the personal transformation they had undergone. The truth they had discovered in the books had given them a new perspective, a perspective that was both painful and liberating. They could no longer live in the world of propaganda that had shaped their identity for so long. The war had been a defining moment, but it was also the beginning of something else, the opportunity to reclaim their future, to rebuild not just their lives, but their sense of self. For some, this meant trying to make sense of the war's aftermath and finding a way to reconcile their actions. They could not undo the past, but they could change how they viewed it. For others, the journey was more about finding a new purpose, a purpose that wasn't bound by the rules of a lost war, but by the freedom to choose their own path, to live as individuals with the power to shape their futures. And here's the truth: if you think the end of the war was the hardest part, you're mistaken. The real challenge for them was what came after. They had been broken, but in the process, they had also found the strength to rebuild. The knowledge they gained in the camps, the freedom to think, was their key to survival. They had surrendered their old selves, but in doing so, they had a chance to create something new. The books had not only opened their eyes to a new world, they had opened the door to their own futures. And with that freedom came the possibility of redemption, the chance to move beyond the shadows of the past and into a new dawn. Subscribe now to see how the survivors of the war found their way forward, and how knowledge became the catalyst for their rebirth.